A good horror story is even more chilling when it is based on a true one. Whichever way may be portrayed, either through books, movies, or other mediums, the fact remains that the events that occurred was once upon a time someone's haunting reality. In this case, it was the realities of the DeFeo and Lutz families during their time in their Amityville home in New York. In the autumn of 1974, a family of 7 would suddenly be reduced to just one surviving member, the one who committed the crime. Before that fateful night, the DeFeos weren't exactly a happy household, with rumors of Ronald Sr. being hostile, abusive, overbearing, and dominant. His way of fathering is believed to have caused Ronald Jr., also known as Butch, develop into a troubled young adult. The DeFeos owned an auto body shop where Butch was employed, but he would often spend his time at bars instead of at work. Butch eventually became addicted to drugs and alcohol, which led him to become violent towards his family. An incident had occurred where he reportedly pulled a gun on his father, and there were other times where he would physically lash out at his family. In the early hours of November 13th, 1974, Ronald Butch DeFeo Jr. snapped. With rifle in hand, Butch went from room to room, murdering his family members one by one as they slept. One of the peculiar things about this incident is that while the murdering unfolded within an estimated 15-minute time span, the way the bodies were found showed no signs of struggle. In addition, the sounds of gunshots oddly did not wake any of the other family members, or at least it didn't draw them out of bed. The bodies were found all face down on their beds, as though they'd been positioned that way. To add to the strangeness, the rifle reportedly had no silencer, and aside from the family dog barking, none of the neighbors reported hearing even a single gunshot going off that night. After horrifically murdering his own family, Butch took a bath, got dressed for work, and eventually reported the murder, claiming he discovered the grisly scene after arriving home from his job. He went so far as to propose that it was the work of a mafia hitman accompanied by 2 accomplices. He said that they showed up at his house that morning, put a gun to his head, and forced him to kill his family members. His alibi wouldn't last long under scrutiny, where DeFeo eventually broke under pressure, admitting to the murders. He later showed police where he had discarded the rifle and the bloodstained clothes. In his confession, he stated, "Once I started, I just couldn't stop. It went so fast." It was said that Ronald Jr. was hearing voices that influenced him to carry out the murders. However, the prosecutors had a psychiatrist argue against that, who had diagnosed Ronald with antisocial personality disorder, meaning that Ronald hadn't actually been hearing voices, nor had he been possessed by another personality. He just thought that the killing of his family was not wrong. DeFeo was convicted by a jury for 6 counts of murder and sentenced to 6 consecutive life terms, which he is still serving at the Sullivan Correctional Facility in New York. There is still a theory that a second killer was also present, but never caught. Just a little over a year following the mass murder of the DeFeo family, the DeFeo residence on Ocean Boulevard would become the dream home for a new family, the Lutzes. With the Amityville home riddled in its gruesome past, one can't help but wonder about the possibility of a residual energy lingering on the property, haunting the ground it was trapped on. But one wouldn't have to wonder for very long before the Lutzes would come forth with their alleged not-so-housewarming stories. After house hunting for what seemed like forever, George and Kathy Lutz finally came across a listing for what they didn't realize at the time was the DeFeo home. They decided to check it out, and while the house was over their original budget of $30,000 to $50,000, they, for some reason, found themselves drawn to the attractive, hip-roofed colonial house with 6 bedrooms, a heated pool, and a large boathouse on the Amityville River. And despite being informed about the house's murderous past, the Lutzes fell in love with the home and decided it would be theirs. They purchased it at the bargain price of $80,000 and never once considered the house to be uninhabitable due to its past. And similarly to the Hollywood portrayal,
kills his whole family? Doesn't that bother you?
Well, yeah, sure, but
they felt that
houses don't have memories.
But the Lutzes' dream home would quickly become one of a nightmare. The events that soon followed would eventually be known to the public through the work of author Jay Anson, who wrote and captured the events in his infamous book, The Amityville Horror. Prior to moving into the house, George Lutz was an active businessman, but immediately after moving in, he underwent a sudden personality change, becoming sluggardly, chilled, and cranky. He found himself waking up at 3:15 a.m. every night and was unable to go back to sleep. Come to find out, it was at this time that the DeFeo murders took place. One night, he saw his 5-year-old daughter Missy standing by her bedroom window, with the outline of a pig's face with red eyes behind her. He quickly ran inside her room, only to find his daughter sound asleep. Shortly thereafter, Missy began speaking of a new friend she was playing with, a pig named Jody. In another chilling instance, George looked down at his wife Kathy while she was sleeping and saw her face had changed and seemingly aged her as if she was a 90-year-old woman. Apparently, part of the house's effect on Kathy was that she would go through periods where she aged unnaturally fast and appeared to be another person altogether. This was reportedly also witnessed by her mother. Strange things continued to happen, such as doors ripped off hinges, a room full of flies in the middle of winter, cloven hoofprints in the snow just outside their doors, green slime oozing on the walls, and the discovery of a secret room in the basement that was nowhere on the house's original blueprint. This room was painted blood red, and was only big enough for 2 people to sit intimately close. It also gave off an intermittent odor. George even tried to take their family dog down there. Instead of the attempt,
he just wouldn't go in. He backed away. It's the only time I can recall him ever cowering from something.
One night, George heard the sound of a band playing downstairs, and when he went into the living room to investigate, there was no one there. But the rug had been rolled up and the furniture had been moved as if someone had made space for dancing. The priest they enlisted to help them also experienced a variety of strange phenomena and illness after getting involved with the house. The Amityville Horror author Jay Anson said meeting the priest solidified his decision to write the book, saying,
"Because it was corroboration. This was actually happening to someone. This was not an exorcist or an omen. From there, I started to create the book."
On January 14, 1976, after just living 28 days in their new home, a particularly scary night drove the Lutzes to suddenly pack their bags, leaving the rest of their belongings behind, never to return again. They didn't expect to leave forever that day. According to a 2005 interview with George Lutz,
"We didn't get up to leave that morning. You need to understand that. This was our house. We lived there. When we left, we didn't know we weren't coming back. We didn't know that what we were leaving behind, we would never see again."
Their belongings at the house, according to a Washington Post article from 1979, were to be auctioned off later. The Lutzes shared the supernatural phenomena that they experienced in their time living in the Amityville house with Anson, who eventually turned their true story into an instant bestseller in 1977. The LA Times hailed it as fascinating and frightening. Some critics have said that its popularity reflected the rocky political climate in the United States at the time, which included rampant inflation, rising interest rates, and a massive oil shortage, all signaling a depressed economy. As the narrative unfolds, the reader also sees the family struggling as their business is impacted by the failing economy, as well as an IRS investigation into the family's taxes at the worst possible moment, making everything in the book all too familiar to readers who were living a similar reality at the time. By aligning something supernatural with the current events of American life, the book turned out to be very relatable. It was also said to have exploited contemporary popular trends of the pulp horror genre, including a family patriarch who was drinking and mean and out of his normal character, as seen in The Shining, enlisting or forcing a priest to help them against his will or better judgment, like The Exorcist, as well as excessive vomiting, also in The Exorcist, and even the setting of a northeastern beach town, like Jaws. When asked if Anson himself had experienced anything strange while writing the book, he said,
"Leave it? No."
Though he did note that he had a heart attack after writing it, which he felt was unrelated.
"Blame it on my smoking, my idiot lifestyle. I'm not going to blame it on this."
However, Anson did say that some of the people who had read the original manuscript or had early copies in their possession did have strange things happen to them. 3 of his friends along with one of their children had separate brushes with death. One was fatal. The first had a fire break out in his car as he was driving back to the publisher with the manuscript. The second friend and his son nearly drowned in their car while a copy of the manuscript was in their trunk. Reportedly, when the car trunk was opened, the only thing that was still dry inside was the manuscript, despite the fact that it had only been held in a clasped envelope. And the third friend, who Manson had given the first 2 chapters to read, died in a fire the first night she received them, and in the remains of the fire, the manuscript was found in perfect condition. There have been several film adaptations of the story, including a 1979 version starring James Brolin and a 2005 version starring Ryan Reynolds, both actors taking on the role of George Lutz. The book and both movies are loyal to the setting and the true backstory of the house where a grisly mass murder had occurred. Both films were said to deviate from the original story slightly, to add to the terror of the hauntings. Such as the addition of a babysitter in both films, who watched the kids while George and Kathy, in the 1979 version, went to Kathy's brother's wedding.
I don't want to go to bed. I want to play with Jody.
In the 2005 version, they just had a night out.
Freaky being back here.
In the book, the entire family attended the wedding.
I got you the first time.
The 1979 version also begins with the murders, like the book, but in a way that features the house itself as the haunted vessel.
Hughes told police he heard voices coming from within the house, telling him to...
In contrast to the 2005 version, which portrayed the murder victims in a way that would focus on their ghosts,
Hi, Lisa.
rather than the house.
Look what Ronnie did.
Another thing that is noticeably different between the book and the movies is that they all establish slightly different versions of what happens to the priest, all of whom have different names. In the book, he hears a voice yelling at him to get out, and then experiences flu-like symptoms when he interacts any further with the Lutzes, ultimately giving up on helping them to essentially go on vacation. But in the movies, there are physical effects on him, like when he is attacked in the house by supernaturally controlled flies, and ultimately goes blind.
Hello, Kathy. Father Delaney, there's something very important.
On the whole, the 2005 version was said to make more things up entirely. And the 1979 film features certain things that happened in the book that the other film excluded, but with less context. Apart from the mystery surrounding Ronald DeFeo Jr. hearing voices that led him to kill his entire family in 1974, and the supernatural phenomena experienced by the Lutzes in 1975, there have been no other known stories or accounts of hauntings in the Ocean Avenue house. According to the Washington Post, and realty firm Coldwell Banker Harbor Light owner Jerry O'Neill, the house has been owned by 4 different families since the murders in 1974. Its address was changed by the request of a previous owner who lived in the house following the Lutzes. The last time the house was listed for sale was in the summer of 2016, and it sold for $605,000 in February 2017, according to Zillow. Before that, the house was sold in 2010 for $950,000. While there are some debates on whether or not the Lutz's story was true, the fact remains that a mass murder of an entire family did indeed take place on that property. That is undeniable. The supernatural has been known to turn skeptics into believers. So whether it's a trinket, a piece of clothing, or an entire house, be careful what you decide to acquire, because you may end up with far more than you bargained for.